Dorothy Lestrange. In the early 1950s, a woman named Dorothy Lestrange lived in New York City and worked as a secretary. However, her real story began when she became involved in a bizarre chain of events. Dottie had an uncanny ability to predict the future, especially when it came to people's deaths. She would call up friends or acquaintances and inform them of tragic news, often with precise details of how they would die. One day, Dottie began calling people she knew to warn them of a mysterious upcoming disaster. She was convinced something catastrophic was about to happen, but she couldn't figure out exactly what. Shortly after making these calls, Dottie disappeared without a trace. Her sudden vanishing remained a mystery for years. Years later, in 1966, a man named Joseph Burris came forward claiming to know the truth behind Dottie's disappearance. He revealed that Dottie was not just an ordinary woman, but a former government agent who had been involved in secret Cold War-era experiments on psychic phenomena. According to Burris, she had been recruited by the U.S. government to help track potential threats, and the strange predictions were a result of her training in remote viewing and other psychological techniques. But the strangest part of the story was that Joseph Burris, who had known Dottie before her disappearance, also claimed to have experienced her premonitions himself. He said that she had once predicted his death in a car accident, and despite all odds, he had narrowly avoided it. But when he tried to share the truth of her past, it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her story remains unsolved, and the more you dig into the details, the more it seems like a plot right out of a spy thriller, complete with secret government projects, psychic abilities, and unexplained disappearances. The clockmaker. In a small town in the United States, there was a man named Tom who worked as a clockmaker. One day, while repairing an old clock in a church, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind the clock mechanism. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it to find a stack of documents that revealed a shocking conspiracy involving local government officials. These documents detailed a scheme of corruption, including embezzlement of funds and falsification of records. Tom was stunned. He had uncovered something that could potentially shake the foundations of his community. Determined to bring the truth to light, he meticulously documented everything and sought ways to share this information without putting himself in danger. As he tried to publish his findings, he began to notice strange figures following him around town. It became clear that someone wanted to silence him. After months of fear and evasion, Tom finally managed to leak the story to a local newspaper. The revelation sparked an investigation that exposed the corruption and led to the arrest of several officials. The truth, stranger than fiction, not only changed Tom's life but also transformed the town forever, reminding everyone that sometimes reality can be more unbelievable than any story. Anastasia. In the early 20th century, a woman named Anna Anderson became famous for claiming to be Anastasia Romanov, the youngest daughter of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. The Romanov family had been brutally executed by Bolsheviks in 1918, but rumors persisted that Anastasia may have survived the massacre. Over the decades, Anna's claims sparked an international sensation, drawing attention from media, historians, and even members of the Romanov family. Anna first appeared in Germany in 1920, in a mental asylum, suffering from amnesia and displaying a strange, sometimes erratic behavior. She claimed to have no memory of her life before the revolution, but she insisted that she was Anastasia. She spoke in Russian, which was odd because she had been raised in a German-speaking environment. She also seemed to know intricate details about the Romanov family, which were never made public. She had a distinctive scar on her body that was identical to one described in historical accounts of Anastasia's injuries, adding an air of mystery to her story. Over the years, Anna's story gained followers, and she was even recognized by some who had known the Romanovs. Yet, others were skeptical, citing discrepancies in her claims and questioning her mental state. Despite this, Anna was persistent, and her claim became a global obsession. In 2007, DNA testing was conducted on remains found in Ekaterinburg, Russia, that were believed to be those of the Romanov family. The tests confirmed the identities of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their children, including Anastasia. However, There was no trace of Anna Anderson in the remains, and she was conclusively excluded from being Anastasia. But the strangest part of this story came years after Anna's death in 1984. In 2007, further DNA testing revealed that Anna Anderson was actually Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had been born years after the Romanov family's execution. It was a stunning revelation. Anna was not Anastasia, but a woman with a traumatic past who had woven a complex fantasy about being the missing princess. Her reasons for the deception remain unclear. Was it a desperate attempt to escape an abusive life? Did she simply long for the royal status she imagined? Or was it an elaborate performance for attention? Regardless, Anna Anderson's life story, which captivated the world for decades, turned out to be one of the most bizarre cases of mistaken identity and self-reinvention in modern history, far stranger than anything fiction could have invented. World War II romance. In a quiet village in England, a woman named Margaret lived alone in a charming cottage. She was known for her love of gardening and often shared her homegrown vegetables with neighbors. One day, while digging in her garden, she unearthed an old, rusted box. Intrigued, she pried it open, only to find it filled with letters and photographs dating back to the 1940s. As she sifted through the contents, Margaret realized that the letters were love notes between two people, a soldier and a local girl. The letters painted a vivid picture of their romance during World War II, filled with longing and hope. Fascinated, she decided to investigate further and learned that the soldier had never returned home, leaving the girl heartbroken. Determined to uncover the truth, Margaret visited the local archives and discovered that the soldier was declared missing in action. However, she found a twist. The soldier's family had been searching for him for decades, believing he had perished in the war. With the help of the letters, Margaret was able to piece together the soldier's journey and ultimately contacted his family. What followed was a heartfelt reunion that brought closure to both the soldier's family and the local community. The story of love, loss, and discovery brought the village together, proving that sometimes the past holds secrets that can change lives in unexpected ways. Margaret's simple gardening day turned into a remarkable tale, reminding everyone that truth can indeed be stranger than fiction. The man who disappeared. In the 1970s, a man named Robert Lane, not his real name, but a pseudonym used for his protection, became known as the man who disappeared. He was an ordinary guy, living in Chicago with a seemingly typical life. He worked as a mid-level manager at a company, had a wife and a couple of kids. But one day, Robert vanished without a trace. Months passed, and the authorities launched a full-scale search. His wife, family, and friends were devastated. His personal belongings were found undisturbed at his home. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. Authorities and private investigators found no leads, no phone calls, no clues, and no ransom demands. It was one of the most baffling disappearances in the city's history. Then, almost 2 years later, Robert Lane showed up in Europe. He contacted his wife from a small village in Spain, claiming that he had been kidnapped by a secret organization. According to him, he had been drugged and held captive in a remote facility where he was tortured for information he couldn't remember. He said that he had only recently escaped and made his way back to civilization. His wife, although deeply shocked, welcomed him back, and the two began to rebuild their lives. But there were inconsistencies in Robert's story. He couldn't explain why he had no memory of where he had been or how he had managed to survive for nearly 2 years in a foreign country. Moreover, his behavior seemed increasingly odd. He exhibited strange, almost paranoid tendencies, and his personality appeared to have changed. It was as if the man who had returned was not quite the same person who had disappeared. Then, in the early 1980s, the truth came to light, and it was more bizarre than anyone could have imagined. It turned out that Robert Lane had not been kidnapped, nor had he been held hostage by any mysterious group. The truth was that Robert Lane had faked his own disappearance in a highly elaborate and intricate scheme. He had deliberately staged his disappearance to escape from his responsibilities. In fact, Robert had secretly traveled to Spain and spent the 2 years living under a new identity. He had worked as a bartender and even started a new life in a quiet, small town. He had invented the story about being kidnapped and tortured to explain his absence, a narrative that he had built carefully to cover his tracks. As for the memory loss, he had feigned amnesia to make his tale more convincing. But what made the case even stranger was that he had left behind a trail of financial deception. In those 2 years, Robert had secretly drained his bank accounts and taken out loans in his own name, which he had intended to use to build his new life. His wife had been left in financial ruin. When authorities caught up with him, they learned that his disappearance had not only been a well-planned escape, but also part of a larger scheme to evade financial obligations. His motives, it seemed, were a mixture of personal crisis and financial greed. The story of Robert Lane serves as a strange reminder of how far some people will go to escape their problems, and just how convincing an elaborate ruse can be. It was a case so outlandish that, had it been written as fiction, it would have been dismissed as too improbable. Black market auction. In a bustling city, a young journalist named Sarah was known for her investigative prowess. One day, she received an anonymous tip about a series of unusual occurrences happening in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Intrigued, she decided to investigate, armed with her notepad and camera. As Sarah explored the dark, dusty corners of the warehouse, she stumbled upon a hidden room filled with strange artifacts and old photographs. Among them was a diary that belonged to a former owner of the warehouse, detailing a secret life as a collector of rare and bizarre items. The diary revealed that the owner had been involved in a black market dealing of stolen artifacts from around the world. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the magnitude of what she had found. The diary mentioned plans for an upcoming auction of these stolen relics, and she knew she had to act quickly. She contacted the authorities, providing them with the evidence she had uncovered. What happened next was beyond anything she could have imagined. The police raided the auction, apprehending several criminals and recovering priceless items that had been lost for decades. Sarah's story not only made headlines but also led to the return of stolen treasures to their rightful owners. In the end, her pursuit of a simple tip turned into a thrilling adventure, showcasing how reality can often surpass the wildest fiction. Into the woods. Absolutely. Here's another wild true story that feels almost too bizarre to believe. In the 1950s, a man named Christopher Thomas Knight, later known as the North Pond Hermit, lived an extremely isolated life that seems straight out of a novel. Knight was born in 1961 in New York, but by the age of 20, he made a drastic decision. He would leave behind all human contact and live alone in the woods. His self-imposed exile was not just a weekend getaway, but a complete break from society that would last for nearly 27 years. Knight disappeared into the dense forests of Maine, living near North Pond in the Kennebec County area. He built himself a small, makeshift camp and relied on his wits and limited resources to survive. For the next 3 decades, he would never interact with another human being. He had no electricity, no running water, and no access to the conveniences of modern life. But here's where it gets truly strange. Knight didn't just live off the land in the typical sense. Instead, he became a master thief, quietly sneaking into nearby homes and camps during the night. He would steal food, clothing, and supplies, never taking too much, just enough to get by. He would often leave behind no trace of his presence, except for the occasional sign of his foraging. Incredibly, Knight managed to keep his secret for almost 3 decades. He lived in the woods for 27 years, completely avoiding detection by authorities or the locals. Over that time, he would occasionally be spotted by hikers or hunters, but he always kept his distance, vanishing back into the wilderness. The local community grew used to the idea of strange disappearances of food and items, but no one ever suspected a human being was behind it. Knight's world came crashing down in 2013, when he was finally caught after he stole from a nearby camp. At first, police officers were shocked to learn of the extent of his solitary life. He had not only survived for nearly 3 decades in the forest, but he had done so without any significant human interaction, without ever forming a connection with the world he left behind. What makes this story even stranger is that Knight showed no signs of mental illness or instability. He wasn't a hermit because of some deep trauma or an inability to connect with people. In fact, Knight was simply following an impulse to escape the pressures of modern society. He had no specific plan to live a long, isolated life. He just couldn't handle the expectations and stress of the world. He later admitted that his decision to withdraw from society was driven by an intense desire for peace and solitude, to be truly alone and free from the noise of civilization. Knight's story raised many questions about human survival, isolation, and the nature of modern society. In the end, after his arrest, Knight didn't seem remorseful. He expressed little interest in rejoining society, preferring instead to remain in seclusion. His desire for solitude had been so strong that he had been willing to live a life entirely apart from the world for nearly 3 decades, all while quietly stealing to survive. What makes this story especially strange is that, had it been written as fiction, it might have seemed unbelievable. A man who disappears into the woods for 27 years without anyone noticing, surviving through theft and sheer willpower, is the kind of plot that seems too outlandish to be true. Yet, Christopher Knight's life proves that truth can be far stranger than anything the imagination can conjure. The librarian. In the early 2000s, a man named John lived a seemingly ordinary life in a quiet town. He worked as a librarian, spending his days surrounded by books and stories. One day, while sorting through a collection of old donations, he discovered a dusty, leather-bound journal hidden within the pages of a novel. Intrigued, he opened it to find entries that detailed a series of events eerily similar to his own life. As he read further, John realized that the journal belonged to a man named William, who had lived in the same town a century earlier. The entries chronicled William's struggles, relationships, and even his dreams, all mirroring John's experiences. The final entry, however, was chilling. It spoke of a tragic accident that claimed William's life on a specific date, which was only a few days away. Feeling a strange connection to the journal, John became obsessed with uncovering more about William's life. He researched local archives and discovered that William had indeed died in a mysterious accident. As the date approached, John found himself increasingly anxious. On the fateful day, he decided to visit the site of the accident, hoping to find some closure. To his shock, as he arrived, he witnessed a near accident involving a car that almost veered off the same spot where William had met his end. John intervened just in time, preventing a tragedy. That day, he realized that the journal had not only connected him to a stranger from the past, but had also saved his life, proving that sometimes truth can be stranger and even more powerful than fiction. Jack McConnell. In the late 1950s, a man named John Jack McConnell, a pseudonym used for privacy, became infamous for a tale so strange that it seemed impossible to believe. McConnell was a seemingly average businessman from Connecticut, living a quiet life with his wife and children. But in 1956, he suddenly vanished without a trace. His disappearance baffled his family, friends, and the authorities. There were no signs of foul play, no ransom note, and no obvious reason why he would leave. His car was found abandoned at the edge of a remote part of town, and there were no clues to explain what had happened. For over 4 years, McConnell's family had no answers. His wife, Mary, was devastated, and even hired private detectives to search for him. The case seemed like it would remain unsolved, until one day, in 1960, a strange man appeared at the door of his wife's home. It was Jack McConnell, alive and well. However, his return was not as joyful as one might expect. Jack's story was beyond bizarre. He claimed that he had been living for the past 4 years as a missing person, deliberately vanishing under a false identity. According to him, he had been recruited by a secret government agency to carry out a covert operation. The agency, which he could not name, had provided him with a new identity, a new life, and had instructed him to disappear for the sake of national security. McConnell claimed that he had been placed in a witness protection style program, although his story didn't quite align with the standard protocol of such programs. He was told that his life was in danger from powerful individuals, and he had to sever all ties to his previous life for his own safety. In his absence, the government had fabricated a cover story and even created false documentation to back up the narrative of his disappearance. But the strangest part? McConnell's story was plausible. When investigators looked into the matter, they found that there were indeed inconsistencies with the evidence surrounding his disappearance, but the details of his story, about the government agency, the new identity, and the fabricated documents, seemed to hold up. McConnell had disappeared at a time when the U.S. government was running a number of covert operations, some involving mind control experiments and secretive intelligence work. He even claimed that his assignment had taken him across several countries, though he refused to give specifics due to security reasons. Yet, there were holes in his story. For example, the agency he referred to was never identified, and some of the details he provided about his mission didn't line up with anything known in government records. Some speculated that he might have been part of one of the many Cold War-era psychological experiments carried out by agencies like the CIA, programs like MKUltra, which involved mind-altering substances and behavioral control methods. The mystery of McConnell's disappearance only deepened when he claimed that he never actually wanted to return home. He said that the life he had been living, though fabricated, was in many ways freer and more controlled than his life as a husband and father. When he returned to his family, he found it difficult to adjust, feeling alienated from his own children, who had grown up without him. After his return, McConnell's life went downhill. His marriage unraveled, and he found himself under the scrutiny of both the public and the authorities. Though he was never charged with anything, his disappearance remained a mystery. Some believed he was involved in secret operations that had no clear explanation, while others thought his mind had been manipulated during his time off the grid. This strange and unsettling story, full of missing years and shadowy government programs, left more questions than answers. Was Jack McConnell truly a government agent, or was he just a man who faked his own disappearance for reasons only he knew? Whatever the truth was, the case of the man who vanished and returned remains one of the strangest and most baffling stories of the 20th century, one that feels more like fiction than fact. The fisherman. In a small coastal town, there lived a fisherman named Tom who was known for his incredible luck. Every day, he would set out on his modest boat and return with a bounty of fish, much more than anyone else in the village. The townsfolk often speculated about his secret, but Tom remained tight-lipped, enjoying the whispers and intrigue. One stormy night, as Tom was preparing to head out for his evening catch, he received a mysterious message on his old radio. The voice on the other end claimed to be a spirit of the sea, warning him of an impending disaster that would strike the town if he didn't heed their advice. Skeptical yet intrigued, Tom listened as the voice instructed him to fish in a specific spot that he had never tried before. The next morning, Tom followed the spirit's guidance. To his astonishment, he hooked a massive fish unlike anything he had ever seen. As he pulled it aboard, he noticed it had a strange, shimmering quality. Suddenly, the fish spoke, revealing that it was a guardian of the ocean, and it had been watching over Tom all along. The guardian explained that Tom's luck was a result of his respect for the sea and its creatures. In exchange for his kindness, the ocean had granted him good fortune. However, the guardian warned that if Tom ever became greedy or disrespected the waters, that luck would turn against him. From that day on, Tom continued to fish, but he also became an advocate for ocean conservation, sharing his story with the townsfolk. His luck remained intact, and the village thrived, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary tales are rooted in reality, where truth can indeed be stranger than fiction. D.B. Cooper. Certainly, here's another strange true story that seems almost too bizarre to be real. In 1971, a man named D.B. Cooper became one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history, but not for any reason you might expect. The mystery of D.B. Cooper is one of the greatest unsolved cases of modern times, and the tale surrounding his daring heist feels like it was ripped from a spy novel. On November 24, 1971, Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a routine flight traveling from Portland, Oregon, to Seattle, Washington. Everything seemed normal at first, until Cooper handed a note to a flight attendant, stating that he had a bomb in his briefcase and was hijacking the plane. The note was taken seriously, and soon Cooper was in control of the situation. He showed the flight attendant a bomb, which he kept in his briefcase, and made several demands. $200,000 in cash, for parachutes, and a fuel tanker truck standing by to refuel the plane once they landed in Mexico. The plane, carrying 36 passengers and crew, was diverted to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, where the authorities complied with Cooper's demands, handing over the ransom money and the parachutes. After receiving his demands, Cooper released the 36 passengers, keeping only the crew of 5 aboard. What happened next seems like something from a heist film. Cooper ordered the pilots to take off again, heading toward Mexico, but instructed them to fly at a low altitude and slow speed, which would allow him to parachute out of the plane. As the plane flew over the dense forests of Washington state, somewhere between 8 o'clock and 10 p.m., Cooper made his escape. He strapped on one of the parachutes, opened the rear stairway hatch of the Boeing 727, and jumped into the night, vanishing into the wilderness. Despite an extensive manhunt, D.B. Cooper was never found. No traces of him, the parachute, or the money were ever recovered. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in American history, but despite hundreds of leads and numerous theories, Cooper's identity and fate remain a mystery to this day. What makes this case so bizarre is how perfectly executed it was. Cooper seemed to be highly knowledgeable about aviation, parachuting, and the intricacies of airline operations. His demands were carefully planned, and the entire heist appeared to be carried out with the calm precision of a professional. He didn't just hijack the plane, he executed the perfect getaway. Years later, a decaying package of money, one of the ransom bills, was found in 1980 along the Columbia River, far from where the plane had been hijacked, fueling speculation that Cooper had survived and had been living under a false identity. The rest of the money was never recovered. Who was D.B. Cooper? How did he vanish without a trace? Was he an experienced criminal, a war veteran, or just an ordinary man with a wild plan? The FBI closed the case in 2016, but theories about Cooper's identity and his fate abound. Some believe he died in the wilderness during his jump. Others think he escaped to Mexico or Brazil, living out the rest of his life as a free man. This story, full of intrigue, skill, and mystery, remains one of the strangest true crime cases in history. The fact that it's still unsolved, decades after the event, makes it feel like fiction, and yet it is an absolutely true story. The case of D.B. Cooper remains a strange, thrilling tale of a man who vanished into thin air after pulling off one of the most audacious crimes in modern history. The tunnels. In a bustling city, a woman named Sarah worked as a graphic designer. She had always been fascinated by urban legends and often spent her evenings researching strange stories from her city's past. One night, while browsing an old online forum, she stumbled upon a chilling tale about a hidden underground tunnel system that supposedly connected various buildings throughout the city. Intrigued, Sarah decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and her camera, she set out to find the entrance to these tunnels. After hours of searching, she discovered a small, inconspicuous door behind an abandoned warehouse. With her heart racing, she pushed it open and descended into the darkness. As she navigated the damp, narrow passages, she found remnants of the past. Old signs, discarded belongings, and faded graffiti. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound echoing through the tunnels. It was a melody, soft yet haunting. Following the sound, she turned a corner and stumbled upon a hidden chamber filled with vintage musical instruments, all covered in dust. To her astonishment, in the center of the room stood a group of musicians, seemingly unaware of her presence, playing a beautiful tune. They were dressed in clothes from a bygone era, lost in their music. Sarah watched in awe, realizing that she had stumbled upon a secret gathering that had been taking place for decades, hidden from the world above. When the musicians finally noticed her, they welcomed her into their circle, sharing stories of how they had been drawn to the tunnels to escape the chaos of the city. As Sarah joined them, she felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. That night changed her life. She became part of their world, blending her passion for design with their music, creating art that reflected the beauty of their hidden lives. The truth of the underground gathering was stranger than any legend, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary experiences lie just beneath the surface. The Great Emu War. In 1932, Australia waged a battle unlike any other in history, the Great Emu War. Following World War I, many Australian soldiers were given land to farm. However, the land was often poorly suited for agriculture, and many of the soldiers struggled to make a living. At the same time, emus, a large, flightless bird, began to move into farmland in Western Australia. These emus, looking for food, raided crops, particularly wheat. Farmers were frustrated. But what happened next is where things took a bizarre turn. In response to the emu problem, the Australian government decided to deploy soldiers with machine guns to deal with the birds. The plan was simple: eliminate the emus threatening the wheat fields. However, emus turned out to be much more formidable opponents than anyone expected. The soldiers quickly discovered that the emus were surprisingly fast, agile, and capable of dodging bullets. Despite being shot at, only a small percentage of the emus were actually killed, and the soldiers found that the birds could scatter in every direction, making them incredibly difficult to target. The campaign lasted for weeks, but despite the government's best efforts, the emus continued to evade the soldiers. The soldiers even tried using trucks to chase them down, but the birds easily outran the vehicles. After several weeks, the government finally gave up, officially declaring the war a failure. In the end, the emus were not only left standing, but they also became something of a national joke, their resilience against the military leading to widespread ridicule. The Great Emu War remains one of the most peculiar and unsuccessful military operations in history, a true case where fiction could never have matched the absurdity of reality. The Lost Treasure. In a small coastal village lived a man named Tom, who had worked as a fisherman all his life. He was known for his stories about the sea, but there was one story he had never told. Years ago, Tom had made a mysterious discovery during one of his nighttime fishing trips. On a clear night, while he was casting his nets, he saw something sparkling in the water. Curious, he dove down and discovered an old, sunken chest. With great effort, he managed to bring the chest to the surface. When he opened it, he found not only jewels and gold coins, but also a diary that belonged to a captain who had disappeared at sea centuries ago. The diary told the story of a lost treasure and a curse that rested upon it. The captain had betrayed his crew and was doomed to wander the seas forever. Tom, who was initially fascinated by the wealth, began to realize that the curse might be real. Strange things started happening. His nets often returned empty, and he sometimes heard whispers in the wind. After a few weeks, Tom decided he had to return the treasure to the sea to break the curse. On a stormy night, he set out and threw the chest back into the water. As soon as the chest hit the sea, he felt an enormous relief. The storm calmed immediately, and the sea seemed to settle. The next morning, when he returned to the village, he noticed that his life had changed. His catches were abundant, and he felt a new connection with the sea. The story of the lost treasure and the curse was true, and Tom realized that the truth is often stranger than fiction. The case of the dancing plague of 1518. In the summer of 1518, in the small town of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, now modern-day France, something strange and terrifying happened. A woman named Frau Trophia began dancing in the streets. At first, it was just a curious sight, but soon, more and more people joined her, until dozens of men and women were caught up in an uncontrollable, frenzied dance. It didn't stop there. Within days, the dancing epidemic spread like wildfire, and by the end of the month, more than 400 people were dancing in the streets. The dancers seemed to be completely unaware of what was happening to them. They danced for days on end, sometimes even for weeks, without rest or sleep. Some danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, and others reportedly died from heart attacks or strokes. The local authorities, baffled by this strange phenomenon, didn't know how to react. Initially, they believed the dancers were suffering from some sort of divine possession or punishment. Attempts to stop them failed. Doctors suggested that the affected people simply dance it out, believing the movement would cure them. In a bizarre twist, the city even hired professional musicians to keep the dancing going, thinking it would somehow help. Modern historians and scientists have various theories about what might have caused the dancing plague. Some suggest it was a form of mass hysteria triggered by stress, food poisoning from contaminated rye, which can cause hallucinatory effects, or even ergot poisoning, a mold that grows on rye and can induce convulsions and hallucinations. But no one really knows for sure. What makes this story even stranger is that no similar event had ever been documented on such a scale before, and no widespread dancing plague was reported again after that summer. The entire incident remains one of the most bizarre, inexplicable events in history, showing just how strange reality can be when it completely defies logic and science. The abandoned gallery. Once in a bustling city, there lived a woman named Sarah who worked as a librarian. She loved her job, surrounded by books and the quiet hum of knowledge. One day, while organizing the archives, she stumbled upon an old, dusty book that seemed out of place. It was bound in leather and had no title on its spine. Intrigued, Sarah opened the book and discovered it was filled with handwritten notes and sketches of places she had never seen. As she flipped through the pages, she realized that the drawings depicted real locations in the city, but they were all from a century ago. The more she read, the more she felt a strange connection to the author, who had signed the last page with the name Evelyn. Determined to learn more, Sarah began researching Evelyn's life. She found out that Evelyn was a talented artist who mysteriously disappeared in the early 1900s. The more Sarah dug, the more she uncovered stories of the artist's adventures, including a hidden gallery where her paintings were said to be stored. One evening, Sarah decided to follow the clues from the book. She visited the locations depicted in the sketches, and to her astonishment, she discovered a hidden door in an old building that led to an abandoned gallery filled with Evelyn's artwork. The paintings were breathtaking, capturing the essence of the city in a way that no one had seen for generations. As Sarah stood there, she felt a presence beside her, as if Evelyn herself was guiding her. It was then that Sarah understood. Sometimes the past reaches out to the present in the most unexpected ways. She decided to restore the gallery and share Evelyn's work with the world. The truth about Evelyn's life and art was indeed stranger than fiction, reminding everyone that stories can transcend time and connect us all. Bonus story. In a small town in the Midwest, there lived a man named Frank who was known for his peculiar hobby, collecting antique keys. He had keys of all shapes and sizes, each with its own story. One day, while rummaging through a flea market, he came across an ornate key that caught his eye. It was unlike any he had ever seen, with intricate designs and a heavy weight. Curious about its origin, Frank purchased the key and began researching its history. After some investigation, he discovered that it belonged to an old mansion on the outskirts of town, which had been abandoned for decades. Local legends spoke of the mansion being haunted, with tales of mysterious lights and sounds emanating from within its walls. Intrigued by the stories, Frank decided to explore the mansion. Armed with a flashlight and his new key, he ventured inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked beneath his feet. As he wandered through the dark rooms, he stumbled upon a locked door that seemed to beckon him. With a sense of excitement, he inserted the key and turned it. To his amazement, the door swung open, revealing a hidden library filled with books and artifacts. As he examined the room, Frank discovered a journal that belonged to the mansion's last owner. The entries detailed a life filled with love, loss, and mystery, but what struck him most was a passage about a hidden treasure buried somewhere on the property. The journal hinted at clues that would lead to the treasure's location. Determined to uncover the truth, Frank spent the following weeks deciphering the clues from the journal. After much searching, he finally unearthed a small chest buried beneath an old oak tree. Inside, he found a collection of gold coins and priceless jewelry. The treasure not only changed his life, but also sparked renewed interest in the mansion, leading to its restoration and the unveiling of its rich history. Frank's adventure became a local legend, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are rooted in reality, where a simple key can unlock secrets long forgotten. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Please like and subscribe if you like to hear more compilations like this. Stay safe, sleep well, and I'll be back later.